The ground is shaking, not out of fear, out of footsteps. 60,000 pairs of feet move simultaneously, raising a cloud of golden dust that engulfs the horizon like a living storm. Camels carry sacks that no man can lift alone. Women wrapped in embroidered silk fabrics walk silently, gazing ahead as if seeing something the rest of the world cannot yet perceive. Freed slaves hold solid gold staffs that gleam under the relentless Saharan sun like small secondary suns. And at the center of it all, at the beating heart of a procession unlike any other in human history, a man rides. He doesn't shout, he doesn't brandish swords, he doesn't demand to be looked at, but everyone is looking, because there is something about him that surpasses the richness of his clothes, surpasses the scepter encrusted with precious stones, surpasses the 500 slaves who carry golden rods before him in perfect rows. There is faith, a faith so solid, so unwavering that it seems to have been carved from the same material as the universe. His name is Musa, Mansa Musa, King of Kings of the Mali Empire. And he's not going to war, he's going to pray. At that moment, in the year 1324 AD, as he crossed the African continent toward Mecca, a lone man surrounded by an army of faith, the world did not yet know that it was about to change forever. But the world will find out. To understand Mansa Musa, you first need to understand the land that formed it. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine. Imagine a continent before it was divided by borders invented by men who never set foot on it. Imagine rivers so wide that you can't see one bank from the other. Imagine forests that hold silences of 1,000 years. Imagine plains where the sun rises so large, so red, so close, that it seems God placed it there on purpose to remind men that he exists. This was West Africa in the 13th century, and in the heart of this vast expanse, bathed by the waters of the Niger River, as if nature itself wished to bless it, an empire grew, the Mali Empire. It was not a small, timid kingdom nestled among hills. It was a colossus, a giant of land and gold that stretched across more than 1 million square kilometers, larger than all of Western Europe at the same time. Its borders touched the Atlantic Ocean to the west and the golden deserts of the Sahara to the north. Its markets pulsed with the rhythm of caravans arriving from every corner of the known world, bringing salt, copper, fabrics, spices, and taking back what the African land produced in almost supernatural abundance: gold, more gold than anywhere else on the face of the earth. There is an expression that Arab merchants used when describing Mali to the sultans of the north: the land where gold grows like plants after the rain. It was no exaggeration, it was almost literally true. On the banks of the Niger River and in the Bambouk and Boure regions, gold was so prevalent in the soil that miners collected it with their bare hands without sophisticated tools, as if the earth simply could not contain all the wealth it carried within itself. And it was in this land that, around the year 1280, a boy was born. His birth name was Musa. In Arabic, the same name that Christians use for Moses, the liberator, the guide, the one chosen by God to cross deserts and lead entire peoples to a promised land. The coincidence, if such a thing exists in the lives of people destined for greatness, was too perfect to be ignored. Musa grew up in the palace of the Keita family, the dynasty that had ruled Mali for generations. From childhood, he observed. While other princes learned to fight, Musa learned to listen. While others competed for the attention of generals and warriors, Musa sat alongside scholars, Islamic sages who came from Timbuktu and Cairo to discuss theology, philosophy, astronomy, and mathematics. There was something different about him from the start. It wasn't ambition, at least not the raw, ravenous ambition that consumes men from within and makes them act cruelly. It was something more like a thirst, a deep, almost painful thirst for understanding. To understand the world, to understand God, to understand his place in the immense tapestry of creation. Years passed. The kings of Mali reigned and died, and Musa continued learning from life, from books, from wise men, from the silent hours he spent in prayer when the palace slept and only the African stars watched over him. He didn't yet know that he would inherit a throne. I didn't know yet that that throne was just the beginning. Because some men are not merely made to rule over a people. Some men are made to leave such a profound mark on the world that history is still feeling the tremor 700 years later. Musa was that type of man, and the moment when this became clear to the whole world was yet to come, on a journey through the desert that no one would ever forget. At that moment, still young, still forming himself as a man and as a ruler, Musa sat alone on the palace terrace and gazed at the horizon. The sun was setting, tinging the sky orange and violet, and the Niger River reflected those colors like a mirror, shattered into 1,000 golden pieces. And he said in a low voice, as if making a promise that only God can hear, "If I ever have power, I will not keep that power to myself." At that moment, nobody heard, but God heard, and God, as always, has a perfect memory. The merchants who crossed Mali at that time brought stories from other places, of European kings who fought over snow-covered pieces of land, of Eastern empires that tore apart in internal wars, of peoples who suffered under the weight of monarchs who took everything and gave nothing back. Musa listened to these stories and felt a tightness in her chest that wasn't fear. It was determination, the determination to be different, the determination to prove that wealth and faith were not opposites, that a man could have all the gold in the world and still have God as his only Lord. This determination would one day change the history of the world economy in a way that no European king, no Arab sultan, no Asian emperor ever managed to do. But before that, there was a throne to inherit. There was a people to learn to know. There was a greatness to be built, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, decision by decision. The story of Mansa Musa was only just beginning, and it went far beyond gold. Wait a moment. Before we continue, because this story will take you to places you can't even imagine yet, I need to ask you something. When you heard about Musa, the man who promised God he wouldn't keep power to himself, did you feel something? A kind of echo, a memory of something you yourself promised or should have promised at some quiet moment in your life. That's where many people get lost. We hear stories of faith and generosity and think, that's something for a king, a prophet, someone special, and he stays out of it. He just watches, as if greatness were a closed club that doesn't accept ordinary people. But not everyone realizes that the same spiritual forces that moved Musa, that thirst for understanding, that promise made in the silence of the night, that conviction that true wealth is not hoarded, but distributed, these forces are available to anyone who understands how they work. And when that starts to make sense in your life, everything changes. The way you see money, the way you understand blessing, the way you look at what you have and decide what to do with it. There is material that I prepared specifically for this purpose. The digital book, Unveiling the Secrets of the Apocalypse, it goes beyond the stories. It unveils the spiritual principles that shape the greatest moments in human history, including exactly what Musa understood about faith, wealth, and purpose that most people will never learn. Access is limited this week. You can find all the details in the first pinned comment below. Now, before I go there to see it, he comments, here's a tip. If this story is already touching something inside you, because the best part is yet to come. No one is born king. Some are prepared for this for years, with tutors and training and ceremonies that teach them the weight they will one day carry. Others simply wake up one day and discover that the world around them has changed, that a series of deaths, circumstances, and ironies of fate have transformed an ordinary man into the only man who can hold an entire people in his hands. Musa was the second type. The Mali Empire had a system of succession that depended on a position called Cancer Sigwai, something like a viceroy, a regent who assumed the throne if the sovereign died in battle or left for the pilgrimage to Mecca. When Mansa Abu Bakr Thankum decided to embark on a maritime expedition across the Atlantic Ocean, leading a fleet of 2,000 ships in search of other lands beyond the horizon, he left Musa on the throne as regent. The fleet set sail. The ships disappeared into the ocean. Abu Bakr Siu never returned. And Musa, who had promised God that he would not keep power to himself alone, suddenly had the greatest empire in the known world in his hands. Imagine that weight for a moment. It wasn't the physical weight of the crown, although the crowns of Mali were heavy enough, encrusted with precious stones that cost fortunes, molded from gold that had been mined from the very land he now ruled. The weight Musa felt that day was of a different kind. It was the weight of millions of souls that now depended on every decision he made. It was the weight of the caravans crossing the Sahara that needed security. of the cities that grew along the Niger River and needed justice, of the students who filled the universities of Timbuktu and needed support, of the poor who knocked on the doors of provincial palaces and needed mercy. Millions of people, millions of stories, millions of dreams that could only come true if the man at the top of power were wise enough not to let power corrupt him. Musa knew what power did to men. He had seen it with his own eyes, kings who ascended the throne full of good intentions and were gradually consumed by vanity, fear, and the paranoia that accompanies those who know that others are always plotting to take what you have. He had read about it in sacred texts, in the accounts of the caliphs, in the stories of the pharaohs of Egypt, who were once men and became gods in life, and then fell like any mortal. There was a fine line between greatness and destruction, and that line was called humility. Musa decided, in the early days of her reign, that she would never cross that line. Not out of weakness, not out of a lack of confidence in his ability to govern, but because he had understood something that most kings never understand. True power doesn't come from within the throne. It comes from within the man who sits on it. He summoned the leaders of the provinces, the generals, the merchants, the religious sages, the chiefs of each clan and tribe within the borders of Mali, and he said to them, in a ceremony that no one there would forget as long as they lived, "I will not be your master, I will be your servant. The difference between a king and a tyrant is not the size of his army, it is the direction in which he points it." The silence that followed those words was different from ordinary silence. It was the silence of people who were listening to something they had never heard before. In the following months, Musa began to reorganize the empire, not by destroying what had been built, but by improving it, creating fairer tax collection systems so that the poor would not be crushed while the rich increased their fortunes, investing in roads so that trade caravans could circulate more safely, strengthening the universities of Timbuktu and Jenne, which at that time were centers of learning that rivaled the best academic centers in the Arab and European worlds. And there was something else. Musa was a devout Muslim, and in Islam there is a concept called zakat, the obligation to distribute a portion of one's wealth to the poor, the needy, travelers, and those in debt, not as optional charity, as a sacred duty, as a fundamental pillar of faith. For most wealthy rulers, the zakat was a formality, a percentage carefully calculated to be as small as possible without technically violating religious law. For Musa, it was the opposite. He gave more than the law required, much more. There are accounts of court scribes who tried to record exactly how much gold Musa distributed annually in acts of charity, and gave up, not because the numbers were secret, but simply because they were too large to be written down without appearing fabricated. The cities of Mali began to change. Beggars knocking on palace doors received not only food, but tools to work with. Widows received not only condolences, but resources to raise their children. Poor students who wanted to study at universities received gold scholarships that covered not only tuition fees, but also housing and food. The people began to call him Mansa, which in Mandinka literally means King of Kings. But Musa preferred another title, one that doesn't appear in official documents, one that existed only in the hearts of the people he touched, the king who hasn't forgotten that he was once just a man. That was the basis of everything. This was the cornerstone upon which one of the most extraordinary stories humanity has ever recorded would be built. And the greatest proof of who Musa truly was yet to come. On a journey he had planned since before he sat on the throne, in a promise he had made to God in the silences of his youth. The journey to Mecca, the hajj, the call that no amount of wealth in the world could silence. There is a question that every powerful ruler faces at some point in their life. It's a simple question, brutally simple, and precisely for that reason, it's the hardest to answer honestly. What is the purpose of all this? What is the purpose of power? What is the purpose of wealth? What is the purpose of armies, palaces, caravans of gold, the treasures accumulated by generations of a dynasty that built its name on the richest land that nature has ever produced? Musa asked himself this question every morning before the first prayer of the day. Because in Islam, the day begins in darkness, before the sun, before the noise of the marketplace and the voices of advisors and the reports of generals about the empire's borders. Before anything the material world could offer, the Muslim rises, purifies himself, and kneels before God. And it is in that moment, in that sacred interval between night and day, when the world still doesn't know if it will continue or not, that the truth comes to light. For Musa, the truth was clear. Gold was not the end, it was a means. A means to do what God had placed in his heart to do. The Mali Empire, at the beginning of the 14th century, controlled somewhere between half and two-thirds of all the gold circulating in the medieval world. Think about that number for a moment. Half of all the gold. Not just in Africa, in the world. The mines of Bambouk and Bure produced quantities that made the eyes of Arab, Egyptian, Genoese, and Venetian merchants gleam in a way that words can hardly describe. Mali's gold flowed north through trade routes that crossed the Sahara, the world's largest desert, an ocean of sand that mercilessly killed unsuspecting man. These routes were carefully protected by the Malian army, and the merchants who used them paid taxes to Musa's government, making the royal treasury virtually inexhaustible. And it wasn't just the gold. Mali also controlled the salt routes, a commodity as valuable in the Middle Ages as gold itself in many contexts. It controlled the trade in kola nuts, ivory, slaves, and cloth. Timbuktu, the jewel of the empire's cities, was simultaneously a commercial and intellectual center of such magnitude that scholars traveled from every continent to study at its university, Sankore, which had a library with over 1 million manuscripts. 1 million. When the Library of Alexandria, considered the greatest repository of knowledge in antiquity, probably had several 100,000 scrolls. But Musa was not satisfied with material greatness. There was a gap that no trade treaty, no diplomatic agreement, no military conquest could fill. He had not yet fulfilled the 5th pillar of Islam, the hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. In Islamic tradition, every Muslim who is healthy and has sufficient resources is obligated to make the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca at least once in their life. It is an absolute religious obligation, not a suggestion, not an ideal, but a duty as fundamental as prayer and fasting. For an ordinary king, the Hajj would be a modest journey. A few guards, a few advisors, perhaps a caravan of supplies. But Musa was no ordinary king. And more importantly, he wasn't thinking of the Hajj merely as fulfilling a religious obligation. I was thinking of it as a declaration of love. A declaration to the whole world, to all the kingdoms and empires and sultanates that looked upon Africa as a land of barbarians, without culture, without faith, without sophistication, that the richest man in the known world was African. He was Muslim. He was cultured, he was devout, he was generous. And he was going to pray. Just pray. With all their gold, not to wage war, not to conquer, not to impress with the power of arms, to bow down before God. This was something no one expected, and that's exactly why it was what would change everything. Musa spent months planning the expedition. Not weeks, months. Because performing the Hajj, in the way he had conceived it, was a project of almost incomprehensible scale. It was necessary to organize food and water for tens of thousands of people crossing one of the most hostile environments on the planet. It was necessary to coordinate the routes so that the groups would not get lost. It was necessary to establish agreements with the rulers of the regions through which the caravan would pass. And it was necessary to decide how much gold to take. That was the most revealing decision of all, because Musa didn't take gold to protect it. He didn't take gold to invest it. He didn't take gold to accumulate more gold. He brought gold to give away. In every city he passed through, in every mosque he visited, in every human heart he encountered in need. Because there was one thing Musa understood about faith, something that many religious leaders preached, but few practiced with the same radicalism. God doesn't need your gold, but the people God created do. And serving people with everything you have is the most direct way to serve God. That was Musa's theology. Simple, direct, devastatingly powerful. The day of departure arrived as all truly historic days do, without grand announcements, without clarions proclaiming to the universe that something irreversible is about to happen. It arrived with the sound of 60,000 pairs of feet lifting off the ground at the same time. 60,000 people. To put that number into perspective, the city of London, during the same historical period, had approximately 80,000 inhabitants. Musa was leading a procession the size of an entire European capital into the desert. There were 12,000 slaves, not as war property, but as part of the royal entourage, each dressed in Persian silk or Yemeni brocade, each carrying a bar of gold. 500 elite servants, each with a rod of solid gold, advisors, generals, Islamic judges, masters of Timbuktu and Jenne, doctors, musicians, poets, court women mounted on litters decorated with fabrics worth more than many entire kingdoms of medieval Europe, and 80 to 90 camels, each carrying between 25 and 136 kilograms of pure gold dust. When the caravan began to move, the people in the towns it passed through would stop everything. Not because of the fear that used to accompany armies, that electric tension in the air that makes animals flee and children hide behind their mothers' legs. They stopped for something else entirely, out of astonishment, and for something that is much rarer to feel in the presence of a powerful person, for hope. Because in every city that Musa's caravan entered, the same thing happened. Gold was distributed to the poor, mosques were built, not promised for the future, but built right there, with materials brought in the caravan by architects and artisans who were a part of the royal entourage. Teachers were left behind with enough supplies for a year to teach the local communities. The caravan route was literally a transformative line drawn across the continent. But what would happen when this line of transformation reached Egypt is something that historians still study with fascination and a certain amount of disbelief. 14th century Cairo was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. Its population exceeded 500,000 people. Its Sultan Al-Nasir Muhammad was one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, and his court was famous for its rigid protocol and the requirement that visitors, no matter how important, prostrate themselves before the throne. Musa did not bow down, not out of arrogance, not out of disrespect, but because for him, prostration was a sacred act reserved exclusively for God. Kneeling before any human being would be, in his view of faith, a violation of the dignity that the Creator had given to man by breathing life into him. There was a moment of diplomatic tension that few historical texts describe with all the intensity it deserves. The Sultan's representative insisted, protocol was protocol. No visitor had ever refused to prostrate himself. Musa listened in silence. Then she said, with the calm of someone who knows exactly what they are doing, I bow before God, who created me and created his Sultan. If the Sultan desires my presence, let him receive me as an equal. If not, I will continue my journey to Mecca, which is where God has called me. The Sultan agreed, because there was something about that man. That unwavering serenity, that faith without pretense, that gold freely given away without anyone asking, that transcended protocol. The meeting between the two kings was described by chroniclers of the time as something extraordinary. Two visions of power facing each other, one based on hierarchy and control, the other based on faith and generosity. And while in Cairo, Musa did what she always did. He distributed gold. So much gold, so naturally, that something unimaginable happened. The value of gold in Egypt, Sentama also, and later throughout the Mediterranean basin, plummeted. There is a paradox at the heart of Mansa Musa's story that makes modern economists blink in disbelief when they first encounter it in history books. The richest man who ever lived caused a global economic crisis by being too generous. Not out of greed, not out of exploitation, not out of war, for giving. When Musa arrived in Cairo in 1324 and began distributing gold to the poor, officials, merchants, and mosques, the logic seemed clear. A rich man using his wealth to help others. A story of exemplary generosity that any preacher in any mosque, church, or temple would use as a model. But economics doesn't work like faith stories. The economy functions through supply and demand. And what Musa did by distributing absurd amounts of gold in Egypt and later in Timbuktu, Morocco, along all the routes his caravan traveled, was essentially to flood the market with gold. Suddenly there was too much gold. And when there is too much of something, that something is worth less. The value of gold in Egypt fell by approximately 25% immediately after Musa's passage. This may seem like an abstract number until you understand what it means in practice. Merchants who had hoarded gold for years, hoping to sell it at the right time, woke up one day to find their savings worth a quarter less than the day before. Without any war, without any natural disaster, because an African king had passed through the city and been generous, the crisis did not remain confined to Egypt. It spread along trade routes like wildfire along a powder keg. Venice, Genoa, Florence, the entire Mediterranean. The whole trade network that connected Europe to the Islamic world and the East was shaken by the wave, caused by the generosity of a single man. Historians estimate that the inflation caused by Musa's passage took approximately 12 years to be absorbed by the global economic system of the time. 12 years, one man, one journey, one decision to be generous, and it took the whole world more than a decade to recover. When Musa learned of the economic impact he had caused, when the merchants and emissaries of the Sultan of Cairo explained what had happened to the price of gold, the story goes that he remained silent for a long moment. Then he asked, "Did the poor people I helped suffer because of this?" The answer was no. The poor didn't have golden savings to lose. The poor simply had more than they had before. Musa heard and said, "So I did what I had to do. It's up to God to take care of the rest." It was not indifference. It was such a profound faith in divine providence that it made him immune to the kind of cold calculation that governed most kings. But Musa was not naive. When he returned to Cairo on his way home after completing the hajj in Mecca, he did something that economic historians consider one of the most sophisticated gestures in medieval financial history. He borrowed it. On purpose. He borrowed large quantities of gold from Cairo merchants at high interest rates, knowing exactly what he was doing. By borrowing gold instead of distributing more, he was contracting the supply of gold in the market. He was removing gold from circulation instead of adding it. It was a deliberate attempt to partially reverse the inflation that had been caused. A medieval king using intuitive monetary policy with the sophistication of a modern economist. In 1324, 700 years before the existence of a science called economics, history doesn't accurately record how effective this maneuver was, but it does record something more important, that Musa tried. That the generosity that had caused the problem didn't prevent him from taking responsibility for the impact and doing something to correct it. This sense of responsibility, this willingness to see the consequences of one's own actions and try to correct them even when no human law required it, was rarer in his time than all the gold he distributed, and it's even rarer in our country. Timbuktu existed long before Musa. But after Musa, the world came to know her. There is a phrase that circulated among Islamic scholars in the Middle Ages like a kind of mantra, a recognition of greatness that few cities in the world have ever received. Salt comes from the north, gold comes from the south, but the word of God and the treasures of knowledge come from Timbuktu. When Musa returned from the Hajj in 1325, he brought with him more than sacred memories and the spiritual certainty of having fulfilled the most important duty of his faith. Drux Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, an architect and poet born in Granada on the Iberian Peninsula, the same place where centuries of coexistence between Christians, Jews, and Muslims had produced one of the most sophisticated civilizations in medieval history, and where now the Christian Reconquista was slowly destroying this multicultural world that had lasted for generations. Al-Sahili was the kind of man who is only born in times of transition, someone who had seen enough of the world to understand that greatness does not belong to any particular people, that knowledge has no borders, that beauty is a universal language that needs no translation. Musa met him in Mecca. They talked for hours about architecture, about faith, about what it means to build something that lasts beyond a lifetime. And Musa said, "Come with me. I have a city that needs your talent." Al-Sahili foi. And what happened in Timbuktu after that arrival is one of the most fascinating episodes in the history of world architecture. Al-Sahili introduced construction techniques to Mali that completely transformed the empire's urban landscape. Before his arrival, local architecture was primarily based on wood and organic materials, efficient for the climate but vulnerable to the elements. Al-Sahili brought adobe brick, clay mixed with straw and dried in the sun, and the techniques for building domes and arches that he had learned in the Iberian Arab world. The Great Mosque of Timbuktu, also known as the Jinguereber Mosque, was the most ambitious project of the partnership between Musa and Al-Sahili. A structure that combined elements of Islamic architecture with organic forms typical of West Africa, creating something unlike anything that existed in the world at that time, unique, unmistakable, African and universal at the same time. Musa paid Al-Sahili 200 kilograms of gold for the construction, an amount that in modern values would represent something between $40 and $50 million. Not just for the project, but for what it represented, the affirmation that Africa did not need to import civilization from anywhere. It could create its own, and Musa didn't stop at the mosque. He transformed the University of Sankor in Timbuktu into one of the world's leading academic centers. At the height of his reign, the university had approximately 25,000 students, more than most European universities of the same era. Theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, history, rhetoric, and music were studied there. The teachers came from Egypt, Morocco, Persia, and India. Students came from all over Africa, from parts of Europe, from the entire Arab world. Timbuktu became what Rome had been to the Roman world, what Athens had been to the Greek world, a beacon, a place people looked to when they wanted to know that humanity was capable of something extraordinary. And behind all of this, there was a man who had promised God, on a silent night of his youth, that he would not keep the power to himself alone. Musa not only kept her promise, he transformed it into a city. Did you notice anything in this story? Musa didn't become famous for conquering. He didn't become famous for destroying. He didn't become famous for accumulating. He became famous for giving. And what's most impressive isn't the gold he distributed. It's his understanding of the relationship between wealth, faith, and purpose, which most people will never grasp in their lifetime, because there is a spiritual principle behind all of this. A principle that appears not only in Musa's life, but in sacred texts, in the stories of the prophets, in the moments when history changed direction and the world was never the same again. And that's where most people get lost. We know the stories superficially, we know the names, the dates, the grand numbers, but we don't understand the mechanism. We don't see what was happening on a spiritual level behind the curtain of historical facts. When it starts to make sense, you stop seeing your own life in the same way. Stop seeing the little or much you have as a burden or a paralyzing responsibility. Start seeing it as a tool, as a language, as a way to speak to God through the people around you. The digital book Unveiling the Secrets of the Apocalypse, it delves precisely into these principles. How the greatest moments in humanity's spiritual history reveal truths that apply directly to the life of anyone willing to see beyond the surface. It may be too late for those who ignore these truths while time is passing. Access is in the first pinned comment. Spaces are limited this week, and if this story is resonating with you, comment them down here. Let the spirit know you're paying attention. There is a specific kind of cruelty that history sometimes practices, not the cruelty of wars, massacres, and persecutions. That is visible, documented, impossible to completely deny even when one tries. The cruelty I'm talking about is more subtle, more silent, and in many ways more devastating in the long run. It's the erasure, the decision, conscious or not to tell certain stories, not to include certain names in school textbooks, not to erect certain statues, to let certain civilizations dissolve into humanity's collective memory, like salt in water, present in everything but invisible to those who don't know how to look for them. The Mali Empire was, for centuries, one of the largest empires in human history in terms of territory, wealth, cultural sophistication, and global influence. Its capital Niani and its cities of Timbuktu and Djenné were known throughout the medieval world as centers of knowledge, faith, and power. Mansa Musa was, by any metric one might use, the richest human being who ever lived on earth, richer than all modern millionaires and billionaires combined. And yet, for centuries, the Western world that would become dominant after the Industrial Revolution simply didn't tell this story. Why? because telling Musa's story meant acknowledging something that certain political and economic interests found more convenient to deny: that Africa was not a continent of barbarians without history, without culture, without civilization, that long before any European ship touched the African shores with colonizing intentions, there were empires, universities, libraries, architecture, philosophy, theology. There was humanity in all its complexity and grandeur. And there was Muse. This erasure was not complete. It couldn't be. Medieval Arabic and Catalan maps, historical documents of extraordinary precision and beauty, clearly depict West Africa, and some, like the Catalan map of 1375, show a figure seated on a golden throne in the center of the African continent, holding a gold nugget in their right hand. The caption in Catalan, the medieval language of northeastern Spain, reads, "This black gentleman is called Mansa Musa, Lord of the Blacks of Guinea. So abundant is the gold found in his country that he is the richest and noblest king in that part of the world." This map was produced by European cartographers 50 years after Musa's journey to Mecca. The memory was still so vivid, the impression still so profound, that a man who had never been to Africa felt the need to record it for posterity. Someone extraordinary lived here. The story of Musa began to be rediscovered by the Western world in the 20th century, when African historians and Africanists began the patient work of rescuing documents, manuscripts, and records that had been buried, sometimes literally, in private libraries in Timbuktu that families had kept for generations to protect them from invaders. These manuscripts, it is estimated that between 300,000 and 1 million of them still exist, scattered throughout Mali and other parts of West Africa, represent one of the greatest intellectual treasures on the planet. And they are, to a large extent, Musa's legacy, because he was the one who created the environment, peace, wealth, the appreciation of knowledge, that allowed all that intellectual production to flourish. Without Musa's investment in the universities of Timbuktu and Djenné, without the arrival of Al-Sahili and other scholars he brought from the Hajj, without the deliberate policy of making knowledge accessible and valued in Mali, these manuscripts would not exist, this knowledge would not have been produced, this civilization would not have reached the peak it did. Musa's legacy wasn't just in the palaces he built, or the gold he distributed, it was in the synapses, in the connections between ideas that can only happen when there is freedom, resources, and the political will to let human thought go where it needs to go. It was in the students who studied in Timbuktu and returned to their countries of origin, from North Africa, Islamic Spain, the Middle East, carrying knowledge that merged with local traditions and produced new ways of understanding the world. It was, in a diffuse and impossible to completely trace way, present in the very development of human civilization. One man, one journey, 60,000 people, unimaginable quantities of gold. And it's an impact that the world is still measuring. But there was a dimension to this story that numbers can't capture. The spiritual dimension. Because Musa knew, with a certainty that went far beyond intellectual knowledge, that dwelt in the deep space where reason meets faith, that what he was building was not just for himself or for his people or for his time. It was meant for eternity, not the abstract eternity of philosophers, the concrete eternity of actions, the permanence of gestures that change lives, the immortality that belongs not to those who seize power with both hands, but to those who open their hands and let go. Everything I give to God, God will keep forever. Musa once told one of his advisors that he questioned the king's excessive generosity. "Everything you keep for me, the earth will keep with me when I die." Mansa Musa has died. All men die like this, regardless of how much land they owned, how much gold they distributed, or how many prayers they said in the dark before sunrise. The exact date of his death is uncertain. Historians debate between 1332 and 1337. He was between 50 and 60 years old, a considerable age for the time, but still too young for what he had accomplished. What happened after his death is a story of a different nature. The story of the fragility of human institutions, of how much a single man can hold up an entire world, and of the collapse that comes when that man is gone. His successors did not have the same vision. They did not have the same faith. They did not have the same ability to balance the military strength necessary to maintain an empire of Mali's magnitude with the generosity and wisdom that had made Musa different from all others. Within a few decades, Mali's borders began to recede. Tributary cities rebelled. Neighbors who had been kept at bay by a combination of respect and fear, respect for Musa's greatness, fear of the size of his army, sensed the weakness and attacked. The Songhai Empire absorbed Mali at the end of the 15th century, and in 1591 a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara with firearms, technology that Mali did not possess, and captured Timbuktu, the city of libraries, the jewel of African knowledge, living proof that Africa had produced one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, fell under the control of foreigners. Many of the manuscripts were burned. Many of the scholars were killed or exiled, and the world, little by little, forgot. But forgetting is not the same as erasing, because there is something in truth that resists oblivion with the same stubbornness with which a seed resists winter. It may remain buried, it may seem dead, it may remain for decades, centuries, entirely covered by the earth of silence, but when the conditions are right, it sprouts, and the truth about Mansa Musa is now coming to light. In academic articles that re-examine the history of medieval Africa, with eyes free from colonial biases, in documentaries produced on every continent, in classrooms in Africa, Europe, America, and Asia, where young people discover with astonishment and pride that the history of the world is much richer, much more diverse, much more surprising than traditional textbooks have taught them to believe. And in conversations like this, in that space between you and me, in that moment when the voice that tells this story finds ears willing to hear it, Musa's truth resurfaces with the same force it always had. Because what Musa represents is not just African history. It's not just Islamic history. It's not just medieval history. It's human history. It is the story of what happens when a human being, any human being, from anywhere, from any time, decides to live according to their deepest values and does not back down in the face of the cost that this entails. Musa could have kept the gold. He could have built walls instead of universities. He could have invested in an even larger army to ensure that no enemy would ever threaten what he had built. He could have performed the hajj discreetly, without the pomp, without the crowds, without the gold distributed in every city along the way. In short, he could have been like most kings, but something within him, something that had been planted in the silent nights of prayer, cultivated in hours of study with the wise, deepened by a faith that was not merely cultural habit but visceral personal conviction, prevented it. And that something had a name: generosity. Not the calculated generosity of the politician who donates with an eye on electoral return, not the performative generosity of the rich who need an audience to feel generous, not the conditional generosity that demands gratitude and loyalty in return. Unconditional generosity, generosity that flows because it is in the nature of generous flow, just as it is in the nature of fire to illuminate and wine to move. Generosity, as Musa deeply understood, does not impoverish the giver, because what you give in faith returns multiplied in ways that human accounting cannot record. Not necessarily in gold, not necessarily in material possessions, in meaning, in impact, in lives touched, in names remembered, not because they were engraved on statues, but because something of who that person was remains imprinted on the soul of everyone they interacted with. Musa died almost 700 years ago, and we are still talking about him. We are still learning from him. We are still being provoked by him, by the enormity of what he did, by the simple and devastating clarity of the principles that guided his actions, by the mirror that his life holds before each of us. The mirror that asks without judgment, but without pity. What are you doing with what you have? Not necessarily gold, not necessarily material wealth, time, talents, knowledge, attention, love. What are you doing with what you have? This is the true legacy of Mansa Musa, not the pounds of gold, not the palaces and mosques, not the economic collapse of the Mediterranean caused by one overly generous man. That's the question he left open, echoing through the centuries, waiting for each new generation of human beings to have the courage to answer it honestly. When you die, what will you have given? When those who come after you look back, what will they see? A line of possession? What have you accumulated? What have you kept? What have you taken to the grave along with your plans and your fears? Or a line of transformation? The lives you touched, the hearts you opened, the world you left a little better than you found it? Musa chose the second line, and the world still feels the warmth of the fire he lit 700 years ago in an African desert. A man with more wealth than any other human being who ever lived, kneeling before God, distributing gold as if it were water, praying. The story of Mansa Musa is not a story about gold. It's a story about choice. At some point in your life, perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps in the quiet dawn that you know all too well, you will find yourself facing a decision about what to do with what you have. It may not be gold, it may be a talent you're keeping hidden for fear of revealing it. It may be a word of encouragement you're holding back because you don't know if it will sound right. It may be a second chance you're refusing to give because your pride still hurts. Whatever the case may be, the principle remains the same. To give or to keep, to open or to close, to flow or to stagnate. Musa understood that true wealth is not what you accumulate. It's what you transform into life for others. And it is precisely this understanding that made him not only the richest man who ever lived, but one of the most inspiring spiritual figures in human history, regardless of religion, race, or era. There is another dimension to this story that deserves deep reflection: dignity. Musa refused to prostrate herself before a human sultan because she understood, with all the clarity of her faith, that the dignity God gives to man cannot be given to another man without it being a betrayal of the one who created us. How many times have you prostrated yourself, not physically but internally, before people, systems, expectations that do not deserve that power over you? How many times have you diminished who you are to fit into the space that others have decided you should occupy? Musa's life is a constant provocation reminding us of who we are. And the final lesson is perhaps the most difficult of all. The legacy that truly matters is not built to be seen. It is built to be felt. Musa didn't distribute gold so that people would admire him. He did it because of who he was, because his actions and his values were the same, because there was perfect congruence between what he believed and what he did. This congruence is rare, but it's possible. And it begins with the same thing it began for Musa: a promise made in silence to a God who listens. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on where you're watching from. May God bless you. Amen.